Hi, I'm Christie Rushenberg with Leaf Along, and this is Faith and Fiction Friday. Over the past several weeks, we've been unpacking the first steps in my novel Path to Prayer, which is a method of prayer that draws on the classic principles of Lectio Divina applied to the stories in your everyday life, so that you may pray abundantly and unceasingly as you make greater connections to your faith. Because to encounter story is to encounter God. So, now that you've picked a story and read the story and applied the faith to the story, this step is all about you. It's really important that whether you're reading a story or viewing a story or listening to a story, that you're making those personal connections, because that's where the deep thinking really starts happening as you're encountering the stories in your own personal life. A couple steps ago, we talked about, in reading that story, looking at identifying who the characters are, what the sequence of events are to unpack the plot, as well as the messages or the themes associated with that story. So, as you're going through and encountering that story, whatever it may be, whether it's a song or a film or a book or something similar, it's really important that you're looking for those personal connections of identification and relation. How do you see yourself in this story? What is similar to you and this story? Where are those connections happening? So in looking at the characters, perhaps you're finding some sort of identification or similarity with a character. Perhaps they have the same background, whether it's a cultural background, a setting background, maybe they're from the same city as you, or perhaps they have the same faith, or perhaps they have the same educational background, or they're the same age. So there's a lot of different areas where you can see yourself as being similar to the characters in that particular story. Sometimes, though, it's just beyond demographic information and also looking at the decisions that that character makes, or even the personality that that character has. Maybe there's an identification happening there. Or it could also be part of the plot. What happens to that character, or where is that character encountering conflict? And then what is that character doing to respond to that conflict? Maybe the choices that that character makes are similar to the choices you've made with your own conflicts. Maybe the conflict itself is something that's similar. Or perhaps even in that sequence of events, in that plot, perhaps the things that have happened to that character or the action that's happening to that character are similar to the certain conflicts or actions that have happened to you. Maybe it's something you yourself have participated in or caused, or maybe it's something that's been totally out of your, and by extension, the character's control, and you're unpacking the response to those uncontrollable situations. And then, of course, all of that is leading up to theme. What are the messages about the character and that character's decisions, as well as the plot itself? Does the story have a happy ending? Or perhaps it's more tragic in nature? Is that message about life similar to a message you hold about life? Do you agree with that message? Because we talked about you as the intaker of that story, as the person interacting with that story, you have the freedom to accept or reject the theme or that message that the creator of that story is attempting to communicate with you. And that in and of itself can be a point of relating, of identifying. If you're finding that you agree with the overall message of the story, that can be really powerful. It can also be really powerful if you completely disagree with the theme of that story, and there might be something more to unpack there. Even if the connection that you're making is through opposites or disassociation, maybe you don't like the character, maybe you hate all of the action of the plot and you completely disagree with the theme or the overall message of that story. That is okay, because there's still items to unpack there in looking at your own life and in praying. So, if you're finding that you completely dislike the characters, if you don't like the action, and if you disagree with the theme, there's still a conversation to be had there. Because why are you not finding identification? Why are you disagreeing? So that also is a bedrock of items to talk about in the next few steps that are coming up. So in all of these ways, you can connect with the story itself, but by extension, you can also connect to your faith by the way in which the story is also similar to the faith. Perhaps the story is a metaphor or a symbolic retelling of some sort of action in Scripture. We talked in the last video about how acts of communion can become acts of communion based in Scripture. So if you're finding that you are identifying with some of the faith connections in the story, whether it's subtle or overt, there also might be a conversation to have there. So this story, or this step rather, is all about you. How are you connecting to the story? Through the characters, through the plot, through the themes, but also how are you connecting to your faith based on how the faith is showing up in that story. So if there are aspects of symbolic meaning, we talked about rain, we talked about communion, any of the sacraments, any of the similar stories, the unpacking of the stories, any of those things, if you're finding connections to yourself in the faith or in the characters, that is where you're trying to really make that determination in this step. So where are you making those connections? How are you identifying? Because you're going to take all of that information into the next step next week when you start exploring all of your thoughts, feelings, desires regarding all of those connections and information. So stay tuned. Next week we're going to unpack the next step, which is digging into your own connections, your own personal connections, just a little bit more. Thank you so much for joining me this week. And remember, to encounter story is to encounter God. Stay tuned.